This is the Western edition of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite in New York and Terry Drinkwater in Los Angeles.
Good evening. The faltering SALT II treaty has received an indirect endorsement from Pope John Paul II and an all-out salvage effort from the Carter administration. The Pope, in a United Nations address, applauded the decisions and agreements aimed at reducing the arms race, but he deplored what he called the desire to be ready for war, adding being ready means being able to start it. We'll have more on the Pope's UN address and his day in New York later in the broadcast. In a nationwide address last night, President Carter made that new arms treaty with Moscow a rallying point. Playing down the dispute over those 3,000 Soviet troops in Cuba, Mr. Carter said that that military presence is not the greatest danger to American security.
The greatest danger to all the nations of the world, including the United States and the Soviet Union, is the breakdown of a common effort to preserve the peace and the ultimate threat of a nuclear war.
Mr. Carter announced steps the United States would take to counter the Soviet troops. They include increased surveillance of Cuba, establishment of a permanent Caribbean Joint Task Force headquarters at Key West, and expanded and regular military maneuvers in the Caribbean area. Mr. Carter also said he had received Soviet assurances that those troops will not be of a combat nature and that they will not threaten any nation. But his long-awaited reply to the troop controversy did not set well with either Moscow or Havana. And in the Senate, the SALT Treaty's opponents hardened their stance in the wake of the president's speech. Phil Jones reports.
Senate Minority Leader Howard Baker, who is opposed to the SALT II treaty, charged today that the president, in effect, did nothing about the Soviet combat brigade. But Baker took up the president's challenge to get on with the treaty floor debate.
I think we ought to go ahead with SALT. I think we ought to go ahead and schedule it, debate it, televise it, attempt to amend the treaty, as I would like to do, or to defeat it, if that seems appropriate.
But several uncommitted senators had some practical political advice for the president.
Well, if I were the president, what I would do would be to ask the Senate to delay consideration of SALT II until probably sometime next year.
The climate in Washington at the present time is such that if SALT treaty is pushed to a vote in the near future, that it will fail.
Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Frank Church said that he would move ahead to complete committee action on the treaty, but that he will insist on a condition dealing with the Russian combat troops, a condition that Church thinks the full Senate will also demand.
I think that it will insist before the treaty takes effect that the president, backed up by our own intelligence agencies, affirms that there are no longer Russian combat forces deployed in Cuba.
There are still not the 67 votes necessary for ratification, and it is clear now that before the president can get the two-thirds needed, more will have to be done on the troops issue, and Mr. Carter will have to submit his 1981 defense budget and 5-year military plan that will convince the senators that he is committed to a much stronger defense. Phil Jones, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
The Soviet official news agency TASS accused the administration of escalating gunboat diplomacy in the Caribbean and said the whole controversy has become a noisy propagandistic campaign. But in all its criticism, the Kremlin found some hope. The president's continued support of SALT. Gordon Joselop reports from Moscow.
The Soviet Union certainly does not welcome the flexing of U.S. military muscle in the Caribbean and sees it as an increase in the arms race. But Moscow does very much welcome Mr. Carter's reaffirmation of his desire to see Senate ratification of the SALT II treaty. The treaty at the moment has the highest priority among pending Soviet foreign policy matters. In recent weeks, some Soviets had privately expressed doubts about whether the president had changed his mind about SALT. There was puzzlement about why he raised the troops issue now, and anger over the way he did it, particularly the rhetoric he used. The Soviet unhappiness with Mr. Carter, which has existed almost from the start of his presidency, was once again very much in evidence. The prevailing theory among Soviets as to why Mr. Carter raised the issue now is that he needed it to improve his chances of winning re-election. And it is no doubt hoped by many here that the president has not succeeded. Gordon Joselop, CBS News, Moscow.
In Cuba, Mr. Carter's speech was reported in detail with no official government comment. But as Ed Rabel reports from Havana, there was some private reaction.
After reviewing a text of President Carter's speech, Fidel Castro met with other leaders of the Cuban government last night. According to sources close to the leaders, there was anger in the air over the speech, which was viewed as an attack on Cuba's sovereignty. Insolent and provocative were words used by one high government official to describe what Mr. Carter said. The Cubans labeled untrue Mr. Carter's statement that Soviet military hardware comes here free of charge. We are paying for it on a deferred payment basis, they said. The Cubans insisted that what President Carter calls a Soviet combat brigade is here only to train Cuban troops to operate and maintain this Soviet equipment. Carter's idea that we are puppets, they said, is resented highly. Increased surveillance of Cuba proposed by the president is alarming to the Cubans. At one time, President Carter, in one of the gestures made earlier in his presidency to improve relations, had stopped altogether the overflights of Cuba by the SR-71 spy plane. The Cubans said Mr. Carter's proposed military moves in the Caribbean, the planned staged landing of a Marine battalion at Guantanamo Bay, represent a major setback in U.S.-Cuba relations. Carter made the speech to enhance his political standing at home, said one Cuban official, but the official added he's lost whatever standing he had here. Ed Rabel, CBS News, Havana.
When I got my own place, my folks were sure I'd never have a good meal again. Well, why worry? I just got myself some Stofers. They make so many good things. Chicken divan, beef stew, green pepper steak with rice, and lots more. Some ready in just 15 minutes, which is great when you're in a hurry. So if you're on your own, get yourself some Stofers and tell your folks not to worry.
This is one of General Tire's top-of-the-line steel-belted radials, and its heritage goes back a long way. Ever since 1915, motorists have relied on quality General Tires to see our land. They still do, whether it's our glass-belted Jumbo 780, our popular-priced Jet Radial, or our steel-belted radials. Quality, choice, price. General has a tire for you.
Sooner or later, you'll own Generals.
The president's announcement last night of a beefed-up U.S. military presence in the Caribbean has brought quick Pentagon reaction, as Ike Pappas reports.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff have ordered the establishment of a permanent Caribbean Task Force headquarters at the little-used U.S. Naval Air Station at Key West, Florida. The 60 members of the headquarters will coordinate stepped-up naval and troop exercises in the Caribbean intended by President Carter to demonstrate U.S. determination to protect that area from Cuban or Russian threat. The headquarters' first job will be to help organize the Marine landing exercise at the U.S. Guantanamo Naval Base on Cuba's southeastern shore, which has been tentatively set now for October 17th. Up to 1,800 Marines will storm ashore on landing barges and helicopters, while 10 Marine jet fighters fly cover. Once ashore, the Marines will fire blank artillery, mortar, and machine gun ammunition and take up positions along the mined fence line that separates the American base from the rest of communist Cuba. The Marines will conduct maneuvers within the vast American base for about a month, and then they'll depart. Senior Pentagon officials, perhaps somewhat tongue-in-cheek, say they do not expect any adverse reaction from Fidel Castro. After all, said one of these officials, we're not going to attack Cuba. Ike Pappas, CBS News, the Pentagon.
Mr. Carter also mentioned a reinforced U.S. naval presence in the Indian Ocean. The Pentagon revealed today that 2 destroyers had been added to the Indian Ocean Persian Gulf Permanent Force and that there would be other ships sent into the area. The United States is not the only country with an unwelcome Soviet military presence off its shores, as Bruce Dunning reports from Tokyo.
The Japanese Air Force staged a mock attack on its own base in northern Japan only a few hours before the Japanese government protested the continuing buildup of Soviet military forces about 200 miles away. Since the first of this year, according to American and Japanese intelligence reports, the Soviet Union has stationed 10 to 12,000 regular Army troops on 3 islands just off the northern coast of Japan. The reports also say the Russians have improved an airstrip and base facilities on the islands, and that the combat troops have attack helicopters capable of reaching Japanese territory. The Soviets seized the islands at the end of World War II, but Japan insists they are Japanese. At the nearest point, Soviet-held territory is just 6 or 7 miles from Japan. The Soviet refusal to return the islands is such a powerfully emotional issue in Japan that Foreign Minister Sonoda felt it politically necessary to have a look. It was the second time this year that the Japanese government had called in the Soviet ambassador to protest the buildup. The ambassador rejected the protest on the spot, refusing even to forward it to Moscow. Despite the sharp protest, the Japanese government says the troops pose no immediate threat. But the buildup is part of an overall increase in Russian military power. This summer, a Soviet aircraft carrier joined the Pacific Fleet, and Japan senses that Soviet strength may soon surpass American capability. The Soviet force near Japan is 3 or 4 times larger than the one in Cuba, and here, too, Americans are directly involved because the United States is committed by treaty to defend Japan. Bruce Dunning, CBS News, Tokyo.
Nice round, Arnold Palmer. But do you always finish up with a glass of orange juice?
Not always. Sometimes I start off with a glass. It isn't just for breakfast anymore.
Orange juice at a recording session, Kathy Lee?
Well, it tastes great, and it's so good for you. Besides, everyone knows it isn't just for breakfast anymore. Nothing's added to 100% pure Florida orange juice.
Hey, I'd like to try orange juice with a hamburger.
Go ahead.
Orange juice from Florida. It isn't just for breakfast anymore.
Reckless drivers are bad enough as it is. But when their record starts pushing up the cost of your insurance, it's time to leave the crowd and head for Safeco Street. And ask your local independent insurance agent about Safeco, the company that thinks careful people deserve to save. After all, it's the people we don't insure that make Safeco such a good deal for those we do.
His appearance at the United Nations today was the highlight of the second day of Pope John Paul II's week-long 6-city tour of the United States. Bert Quint reports.
John Paul came to the United Nations to use the influence of his position as leader of 700 million Catholics and the power of his personality to try to blunt what he sees as a threat of destruction to the human race. He evoked the words spoken by Paul VI on that occasion 14 years ago when for the first time a pope addressed the world body.
No more war. War never again.
John Paul urged the superpowers to end the arms race. Being ready for war, he said, means being able to start it.
It also means taking the risk that sometime, somewhere, somehow, someone can set in motion the terrible mechanism of general destruction.
For an hour, representatives of 150 nations remained silent as the Pope spoke with quiet passion in this, for him, a foreign language, lashing out at injustice of any kind. The pontiff said the memories of places like Auschwitz, the Nazi extermination camp in his native Poland, should be warning signs.
Everything that is a continuation of those experiences under different forms, namely the various kinds of torture and oppression, either physical or moral, carried out under any system, in any land. This phenomenon is all the more distressing if it occurs under the pretext of internal security or the need to preserve an apparent peace.
On the Middle East, the Pope reiterated the long-standing Vatican position that an overall peace is necessary.
A peace that, being necessarily based on equitable recognition of the rights of all, cannot fail to include the consideration and just settlement of the Palestinian question.
John Paul urged, too, that a special statute be drawn for Jerusalem, one that would respect the heritage of Christian, Jew, and Muslim. To keep his speech relatively short, the Pope eliminated many sections of his prepared text dealing specifically with his church. This was as close to a non-denominational political address as a pontiff could be expected to make. Through it all, however, was a demand for greater morality on the part of individuals and their governments. He insisted that every human is endowed with a dignity that, as he put it, must be respected and safeguarded if peace is to prevail. Bert Quinn, CBS News at the United Nations.
We'll have more on the Pope's visit to New York later in this broadcast. The militant provisional wing of the Irish Republican Army today rejected Pope John Paul's appeal for peace and vowed to continue the war against the British in Northern Ireland. The IRA's Sinn Féin political front in Dublin also said there would be no ceasefire. In Tehran today, about 1,500 demonstrators demanding work had to be dispersed by gunfire outside the Iranian Prime Minister's office. The crowd shouted, "Death to the fascist regime and death to the Islamic government." There were no word of injuries or arrests.
Hey, Corvallis, Oregon. Who introduced the radial tire?
He did.
Hey, Lexington, Kentucky. Who makes only radial tires?
He does.
He's the Michelin man, and at Michelin, we put you first. That's why we won't make a second-best tire, because the only thing more important than our tires are the people who ride on them. Hey, Independence, Missouri, who's the fastest-growing tire company in America?
Michelin.
At Michelin, we put you first.
Lieutenants, prepare for takeoff.
Well, we're finally going to see Hawaii.
I'm not so sure.
What's the matter?
I can't find our traveler's checks. Check your bag, please. Excuse me. Sure. What's the problem? I can't find our traveler's checks. Just be a second. Just be a second.
What's the problem?
I lost my traveler's checks.
Okay, look. When you get to Honolulu, American Express will replace them.
They weren't American Express.
I wish I could help you.
Other travelers' checks give refunds, but most people choose American Express. Ask for them by name.
A steam generator tube ruptured at the Prairie Island nuclear plant in Red Wing, Minnesota today, releasing radioactive gases inside the plant and out into the atmosphere. The release lasted at most 27 minutes, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission reports that the amount of radioactivity released was so small that it could not be measured outside the plant. A spokesman for Minnesota's governor said tonight that there is no danger to people living near the plant and that no evacuations were planned. The Prairie Island plant, however, has been shut down.
Authorities still are investigating the cause of the release of radioactive gas at the North Anna reactor in Virginia last week, and the probe has turned up a curious operating method. Richard Roth reports.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission today questioned the use of a paperclip and a pencil to wedge open a control room switch on the billion-dollar North Anna nuclear power plant operated by Virginia Electric and Power Company. Although the utility today reversed its earlier position, saying the pencil and paperclip were not being used at the time of last Tuesday's reactor shutdown, and so had nothing to do with the release then of some radioactive gas, company officials conceded the jury-rigged method may have been used in the past, but according to a company official, only during tests. Officials of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is investigating last week's incident at the Virginia reactor, say they still want to know why a paperclip and pencil was used at all to control a crucial switch.
The paperclip and the pencil may better not be a popular thing in plants, and I'm sure from here on in we'll make it very clear that that's not something we either condone or are very pleased with.
A utility spokesman said that while there may be an uncomfortable connotation associated with using a pencil and paperclip to wedge a switch on an atomic reactor, the company's investigation so far has not determined that would violate any federal safety rules. Richard Roth, CBS News, Washington.
And the investigation of the 3 Mile Island reactor accident 6 months ago has revealed a situation more serious than then realized. In fact, the federal nuclear official who took charge, Harold Denton, told a Senate hearing today that if he had known then what he knows now, he would have recommended a precautionary evacuation of the area. Recent and controversial reports, a publication that is, of nuclear weapons secrets raised serious questions about the government's protection of such information. The Senate subcommittee heard testimony on that issue today, and Mariah McLaughlin reports.
Taking account of these revelations,
according to government witnesses, at least 8 highly sensitive documents containing important design information regarding thermonuclear weapons were mistakenly declassified and placed on the public shelves in a government library. The Atomic Energy Commission undertook a massive declassification program in the early 70s. almost 3 million documents were reviewed in what one witness testified was a too hasty and not properly organized program. According to another witness, the recent publication in 2 newspapers of mistakenly declassified documents on the H-bomb design could have serious implications for our national security.
The prime effect of releasing this information, in my judgment, is to shorten the time that it will take a nation from the time they develop a fission bomb to the time they are able to have a thermonuclear bomb.
During the time the highly sensitive material was available to the public, Committee Chairman John Glenn said thousands of foreign visitors came to the library, including many from the Soviet Union. The Energy Department says it now has removed all sensitive documents from public access and that it has tightened up on its declassification procedures. Mariah McLaughlin, CBS News, Washington.
Preparing to resume work on the Tellico Dam power project, that's not a nuclear one, the Tennessee Valley Authority captured 53 more snail darters today and moved the tiny fish to another river 40 miles away. About 100 of the snail darters were moved there last winter and reportedly are thriving, and some 700 were shifted to still another river 4 years ago. Work on the Tellico Dam has been halted for some time, partly in fear that the project threatened the extinction of the snail darter. An Amtrak train from Los Angeles to Chicago derailed early this morning in Lawrence, Kansas, killing 2 persons. The train was traveling a new route because of Amtrak budget cuts. Tom Miller of KCMO-TV, Kansas City, has the story.
The 18-car train left the track as it rounded a curve on the outskirts of Lawrence. The Southwest Limited was making its maiden run east after Amtrak officials ordered it merged with the Lone Star, which had been scheduled to be dropped. Authorities say of the 152 passengers and 7 crewmen on board, 99 were injured, several critically. 2 crew members died in the dining car, which was shredded as it slid along an embankment. A baggage car slid into a home along the tracks, but no one in the home was injured. The Amtrak train was running on Santa Fe rails when the accident occurred. Railroad spokesmen say new rails and ties had been put in along the site of the derailment several months ago, but they declined to speculate on the cause of the derailment. A railroad crane and heavy equipment began clearing the wreckage off the tracks shortly before noon. Santa Fe officials hope to have the line open again late Wednesday. Tom Miller for CBS News, Lawrence, Kansas.
A railroad spokesman said that the train was moving at 78 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. Well, what comes down must go up. So said determined crew members today after their unsuccessful attempt to be the first to float nonstop in a balloon across the United States. The flight, which lifted off from Oregon Wednesday, ended when a storm forced it down in a Spencerville, Ohio farm. The pilot was hospitalized with a broken leg. The Da Vinci Transamerica was just 4 hours short of breaking the endurance record for helium-filled balloons, and 2 crew members talked of trying again. A judge in Los Angeles today ruled that non-commercial use of videotape recorders does not violate copyright laws. Universal Pictures and Walt Disney Studios brought suit against Sony Betamax to stop viewers from taping movies and broadcasts from television sets. The studios say they will appeal. For a while, it appeared that the price of gold, which broke through the $400 an ounce barrier yesterday, might approach the $500 mark today. But then there was a selling wave, spurred by profit-taking and rumors of a new U.S. effort to prop up the dollar. Gold prices in London and Zurich fell sharply from their peaks, but they still closed at record levels. The fluctuation in gold prices helped send the stock market way up today in heavy trading.
You dance on a river of wood, and the spinning shapes in the cold, dark water are your only bridge home. So you keep on dancing until the last log is in place and you can head for Miller time. Time for the best-tasting beer you can find, Miller High Life.
When it's time to relax, we've got the beer, Miller beer. If you've got the time, we've got the beer.
Talk about microwave features? Look at the size of this oven.
You're gonna love it.
It cooks.
Features, features. Every microwave has one they brag about. Trouble is, to get one, you have to give up another. Unless you get common sense from Magic Chef, it doesn't make you choose between a complete meal oven, 3-level memory, slow cook, keep warm, or delay start. It features them all. The only thing Magic Chef does ask you to give up is time in the kitchen.
It was a message of peace that Pope John Paul II brought with him to New York City today, and it was a reception filled with enthusiasm and warmth that New Yorkers returned to the pontiff. The Pope's pilgrimage has taken him through Manhattan and into the Bronx tonight, as Bill Plant reports for the Western Edition.
Crowds had been sparse along the route from LaGuardia Airport in the morning, but New Yorkers turned out for the Pope when he went to lunch after his UN address at the Vatican UN mission, demanding to see him in a distinctly American cheer. Minutes later, he obliged, appearing in an upstairs window. In the late afternoon, thousands filled Fifth Avenue for blocks on either side of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and John Paul II, walking around the huge church, basked in their affection. Music swelled from the cavernous interior as the Pope, attended by cardinals and bishops, blessed the crowd outside, then entered to be greeted by thousands more. Tonight there are 80,000 people in Yankee Stadium for the celebration of a papal mass. It began with a procession onto the field. The theme of the liturgy was human rights and dignity. And in prepared remarks, John Paul II reminds these faithful that there are many poor around the world, some in their own midst. He exhorts the congregation never to leave the poor only the crumbs from the table, but to treat them like guests at the family table. And he notes pointedly that it is not right for rich countries to maintain their standard of living by drawing off the energy and raw materials meant for all. Bill Plant, CBS News, New York.
And that's the way it is. Tuesday, October 2nd, 1979. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
The 80s are coming, America, and your Chevy dealer must make room for them. So it's your chance to get a great Chevy value, because right now your Chevy dealer's year-end car and truck clearance is on. With a great choice of new 79 Caprice and Impala sedans and coupes and station wagons, Monte Carlos, Malibus, plus tough full-size Chevy pickups, vans, and Blazers. Come in now during your Chevy dealer's year-end clearance. Get a great Chevy value. All you have to do is hurry.
Good morning. Today you've got a 9 a.m. meeting, a 3 o'clock flight, and don't forget your vote.
What? Forget what?
Your vitamins?
Where are they?
In your cereal, Product 19.
Remember, a 1-ounce serving of Kellogg's Product 19 cereal has a whole day's allowance of 10 essential vitamins and iron.
Delicious.
Your vitamins.
Now she tells me.
Vitamins that taste too good to forget. Product 19.
A very smart start.
This has been the Western edition of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite in New York and Terry Drinkwater in Los Angeles.